Hey guys, I'm Amira and welcome to Open Up. This is your communication podcast and I am your host, also known as the communication expert. I'm your podcast host, your life coach, and also a speaker. Each and every single week, I'm going to be bringing you conversations to help you level up the way that you communicate, whether that's with yourself or in your relationships. Through each conversation, you're going to leave with food for thought, skills that you didn't know you needed, and ways to develop your relationships. So join me here as you learn the lessons that you didn't get to learn at school. Pull up a seat and join us as we open up. Hello, and welcome back to another episode. I'm just going to put this out there first of all, okay? This is the first season that we are recording both video and audio for my solo episodes, and I still just don't think I'm comfortable. I don't think I've leaned into this fully yet. So any feedback you want to hit me with, go for it. I'm going to take it. But I'm hoping by the end of this season, I've really eased into this. We'll see. We're going to see how this goes, okay? Now, today is going to be a topic that I think is going to come as no surprise, but one that I don't think we've done a real kind of deep dive or recap into. And it's so common. It's what I work so closely with my clients on. I talk about it so much. And I want to kind of bring it back. And especially as we go through a new year, setting these intentions, really working towards our goals, then we also, as part of that, have to get our internal dialogue, aka your chatter, under control. Now, I always refer to it as your negative self-talk. Sometimes it can show up as critique. Sometimes it can show up as a mean voice. Sometimes it can show up as a bully. But we all have an internal dialogue. And our internal dialogue is there for a reason. It's there to help us. It serves a purpose. But what we need to really think about is, when does that internal dialogue turn unhelpful? When does it become critical or mean? And then when does it spiral out of control? And what is the impact that it's having on your life? Now, I think one of the hardest things is to start to tune into what that negative dialogue is for you. Because for a lot of us, I always like to give the analogy, it's like Alexa. You've got Alexa playing in the background. You might be cooking, you might be cleaning the house, and Alexa's on, and you've got your soundtrack. But if I asked you, okay, well, what were the last 2 tracks Alexa just played? Would you be able to tell me? And that is often how our negative dialogue works. It's there and it's happening, but we're not actually aware of what we're saying to ourselves. We're not aware of how critical we are being. And if we don't learn how to take control of it, it's going to have a huge impact. It's going to stop us showing up in relationships in the way we want. It's going to stop us going for job offers, or we're going to get those job offers and then we're going to feel a hell of a lot of self-doubt creep in. So it's important to start to understand, how does your brain work? And especially if we're in the mindset of achieving, striving, doing something better, constantly putting ourselves in new environments. Now, I think one thing I hear a lot of is, all right, let's stop your negative self-talk. Let's control your inner critic. But actually, I want us to take a completely different perspective on this, because we have somewhere between 60 to 90,000 thoughts a day. And not only are the majority of them negative, but the majority of those negative thoughts are also repeated. So you aren't the only person with this negative dialogue, with this critical voice, this mean voice, berating yourself, beating yourself up. And it can impact and affect all of us in different shapes and in different times of our lives and in different ways. So going back to the Alexa example, I want you to come out of this episode really tuning into, what is your inner dialogue saying? Like, what's that inner conversation that you have with yourself? When is it serving you? When is it lifting you up? When is it doing you well? And when is it not? And it might be, for example, you're tripping yourself up into comparison trap. Perhaps you're constantly focusing on what you don't have. Perhaps you feel like you're not doing a good enough job. And I remember one of my first clients I coached, we worked extensively on retraining their brain and this negative dialogue that they had, because it got to the point where it even impacted their relationship they had with their partner. And they even got to the point where they were preempting something negative without anything happening, and even got to the point where they were self-sabotaging the relationship. So I want you to kind of take a pause and ask yourself two questions. The first question is, are you aware of your negative self-talk? And second question, are you aware of actually some of the things that you're saying to yourself? And if you are, where is this hindering you in your life? Because if you've listened to the previous solo episode, we've talked about building habits and creating this identity and this version of you for the next 12 months and beyond that. But part of this is also taking control and learning the tools to master your inner dialogue so that it doesn't spiral out of control, so that you don't feel so lost in a midst, can I say that? I think so, of the negativity, that you then don't get to live the life that you want to. So tune into what you're saying. Now, I probably see this a lot with my clients, that can be incredibly difficult to notice what you are saying to yourself, especially because it's very, very habitual. So I always say, if you can just start by noticing one thing a day, like even if you just set the intention at the beginning of the day to say, I'm going to see if I can note down one negative thing I've said to myself today, then by the end of the week, you'd notice 7 things. Now, the reason I want you to start catching the way that you're speaking to yourself is a couple of reasons, but I'm going to give you a quote first of all, because I think that this is going to sum it up so beautifully even. It's a Gandhi quote. So your beliefs become your thoughts become your words, and your words become your actions. So I always say the whole point of us being able to identify what your internal dialogue is saying and when it's negative is it's like a window into your subconscious. Now, if you're listening to this episode for the first time, I talk about your conscious and your subconscious a lot. And I always talk about your subconscious as, like, I always touch my heart. It's like your core, it's your underneath. Your conscious is what you're aware of, okay? Now, in our subconscious, we have our programming, our beliefs. And often we have a set of limiting beliefs that are stopping us living our life in the way that we actually truly want. And the thing about our brains that is very important to understand is not only are the majority of our thoughts negative, but we have told ourselves certain stories, we have certain narratives about life, about different areas of our life that we honestly, truly believe to be true. Now, the good thing is that if our brains have been wired like this from an evolution point of view, which I'll come back to in a second, we can actually retrain our brain. But I want you to notice and be aware, first of all, of the stories that you truly believe are true, but actually aren't. Now, example I give a lot is, for so many years, I said I wasn't an entrepreneur. And I was like, no way. The longer I kept that narrative going, the longer it took to start a business. And I had to rewire that, and I had to change that in order to really embody what I do now. And we're almost 3 years on, so I'm going to say we're not doing a bad job. So going back to that quote, the reason I want you to start to tune into what you're saying and how you are speaking to yourself, not only because the relationship you have with yourself is one of the most powerful relationships that you have and will also impact the people around you, but because it is a beautiful window into your subconscious, and that is where your set of limiting beliefs essentially sit. And we want to be able to identify what those limiting beliefs are that are stopping you from dating, that are stopping you from going from that next position in your career, that's stopping you from having boundaries with your family, that's stopping you coming out of that unhealthy relationship because you believe you're going to be a bad person. if you actually speak up for what you want. So this is the beautiful way that it all fits together. So one, I want you to be aware of your brain being incredibly powerful. It's been wired from an evolution point of view to think negatively. So as I've said already, for most of us, our brains have been wired to think negatively. And if we trace it all the way back to, I say, caveman days, then it was a protective mechanism. It was a way of our brains making sure that if there was a threat, we would be safe. And whilst it worked really well then, there are a lot of the threats then don't exist now, except our brains haven't really evolved too far down the line from that. Hence the reason why we're still programmed to think on the negative bias. Now, your job and your responsibility, which we're going to go through today, is to learn how to retrain your brain, which is so doable. And yes, it creates consistency, which I also feel is like a really lovely lead on from our last solo episode, which is all about habits. So if you haven't listened to it, listen to this one afterwards, because I think it'll be a beautiful tie-in. But you have to be able to retrain the way that you speak to yourself. You have to be able to pick out those beliefs that you have about your life, because those stories, those narratives, those identities that you attached yourself to, they're the ones that are stopping you living your life. Now, I would say one of my probably biggest, oldest narratives that I've had in my life is being the underdog. And for most of my life, I believed that I had to fight for things. And whilst I'm an incredibly hard worker, and I love to say that is one of my strengths, having that narrative wasn't serving me and it wasn't helpful. And so part of this was me retraining my brain to understand that I no longer needed to fight. I no longer needed to view myself as the underdog. And the reason it did me such a disservice is because I wasn't very good at holding space for the good things, for the times that I'd want to celebrate something, for the wins. And I know my clients, if they're watching or listening, I talk about your wins a lot and being able to mark those and take those small moments in. So I had to learn how to let go of that narrative. I had to learn how to let go of the story of that I'm not an entrepreneur, I'm not creative, I could never run a business, because we are, and we're learning, and we learn a very steep learning curve every single day. So that's the first thing I want you to really think about going into today's episode before I even take you through the steps that are going to help you retrain your brain. One thing I want to share in this episode is a little more on being able to identify what your gremlins are. So I've talked about your chatter. We've all got this internal conversation going on. Great, beautiful, it's there, it helps us, it serves us. Your job is to understand, when does that shift into negative internal dialogue and your negative self-talk? Is that voice green? Is that voice critical, mean? I was trying to put too many words together. Is that voice critical, mean, a bully? How is it showing up? And as we move into starting to identify like these stories that are showing up for you that right now you believe to be true, I want us to talk about gremlins, because it is such a beautiful tool and a beautiful way for you to see what those stories are, see how it's showing up for you in your life, and understand how it's impacting you. So I always say your gremlins are those unhelpful beliefs, those unhelpful stories that you have told yourself. And we need to be able to find them. So I basically want you, I was going to say to become Sherlock Holmes. That sounds so uncool. But I basically want you to go and investigate. Your job is to find these gremlins before they take control. Because if you don't learn how to manage those, right, that's where it spirals. And the more you let those gremlins run wild as though they are true, and as though those stories are true, these are the moments where you'll find yourself not speaking up for a promotion at work. This is where you'll find yourself compromising your needs when you're dating somebody and actually there's like 5 red flags that you should have acknowledged from the first date. This is when you struggle to advocate for yourself and really put yourself forward for things because you don't believe that you're qualified enough or that you have the skill set. So I'm going to give you 3 questions that are going to help you identify your gremlins. Now, just as a bit of a recap, I've shared a couple of what mine were in terms of not thinking I was an entrepreneur, not feeling like I was creative, feeling like I needed to be the underdog, feeling that I needed to fight. So here's 3 questions I want you to think about in order to help you identify your gremlins. So I want you to think about a situation where there was an emotion or an outcome that you didn't want. So I can remember distinctly, I talk about this one as an example a lot, but in my corporate career, there was one particular time where I was going for a promotion. I was super convinced that this was for me. And I didn't get it. Without us going into this story right now, didn't get it is the bottom line. So that is a really good example of a situation, an outcome, and a feeling, like an emotion that I didn't want. Okay. That emotion was I felt extremely disappointed. So that's the first thing. Think about a situation or an emotion that you didn't want. Now, the second thing I want you to ask yourself is, what were you doing in that situation? So for me, it was probably the first time actually that I had really truly advocated for myself and put myself forward for this. Now, as an internal role, I, to some extent, was already, or I believed that I was already doing the role. So that's what I was doing at the time. I was having a conversation with my boss. I was positioning why I thought I'd be a good fit for it. Now, what I was thinking in that moment was I already had a little bit of doubt in terms of being able to put myself forward for it, but I truly thought that I could do the job. Now, as a result of not getting it and the way that it was managed, my gremlin kind of had a field day and ran wild, because the gremlin there was, see, I told you you shouldn't have spoken up. You think you're better than you are, and actually you were never going to get the job. And that was reinforced by a conversation that went on with me and my manager. So there are 3 questions to help you start to identify what is the gremlin. And your gremlin, I want you to literally imagine it as a little gremlin running around your brain. And your job is to catch that gremlin and actually question and think about, okay, is it true? Is what that gremlin stands for, is that true? Or can you actually challenge that? Because your brain is a muscle. The same way you go to the gym, the same way you get up and you brush your teeth every day, is the exact same way that I want you to look at retraining your brain. You don't ever get to stop, right? We're all constantly growing and evolving. You don't wake up one day and say, hey, I brushed my teeth yesterday. I don't need to brush them today. So this is something that it takes consistent practice to be able to reframe those gremlins. Once you've identified your gremlins, which are your unhelpful behaviors and beliefs that you have about yourself, before we actually get into the steps I want to take you through to retrain your brain, because I think that is what I have banged on about this episode, I want to talk a little bit about the different ways that your negative self-talk can show up. So there are many different filters or different lenses in terms of how your negative self-talk can show up. I'm not going to go through an exhaustive list today, but I do want to go through a few examples, and I want you to be very, very honest with yourself in terms of how does it show up for you. And I think in my client sessions this week alone, we've been able to identify theirs, but some of my clients who've been working with me for a while have been able to catch it themselves, define it, and really see the impact that it's having on their life. Okay, so the first type of negative self-talk that might be showing up for you is mind reading or assuming. Now, if this is the way that your negative self-talk shows up, bear in mind, you might be able to relate to all of these. So there's no limit. It's not that only one shows up, and there's overlap between them. So kind of bear that in mind. But if your negative self-talk shows up as mind reading or assuming, you tend to look for the worst case scenario, and you will try and assume what somebody else thinks or feels. Now, I would say probably one of the most common examples people play back to me is if they're doing a presentation or standing up in front of a group of people, and they will say to me, Amira, but the audience didn't like it, or they were bored, or I don't think they thought I was very good. And my question is to say, well, what made you think that? How did you know that? And whilst usually people are judging off of other people's body language, you don't actually know. So if your negative self-talk is showing up in this way, what I want you to do is actually challenge it. Where is the evidence, not your guess, not you assuming, but where is your evidence that actually what they are thinking about you is bad or negative, because this is often where your story, your unhelpful gremlin, is showing up, and this is where we need to catch it, challenge it, and change it. The second type of negative self-talk is where we over generalize. One I see show up a lot. Now, this could show up in the form of you having a negative experience and your response to it is to generalize in a way that always happens. Or typical, I can never find the good guys. I probably think when it comes to dating, common phrase I hear is all the good ones are taken, or dating is so hard. And that comment can come off the back of a bad date, a negative experience, being in a situation with somebody with red flags. But what we're doing is overgeneralizing and applying a sweeping statement to absolutely everybody. So you will often take a previous situation that's just happened to you and apply it to all future situations. So a really good example is when I said, oh, dating so hard, or all the good ones are taken, or I'll never find somebody. What are you basing that on? Are you basing that on your previous experiences? Because that's actually what needs to be challenged. Okay, one of my favorites is your extreme thinking, your all or nothing mindset, your black and white mentality. And this is where you tend to think in extremes. Now, it could be, for example, you not getting the grade you want or the result you want, or maybe the promotion you want at work, if we're talking about a career sense. And your negative self-talk could show up in a way where you berate yourself. You say, oh, so stupid. Why did I expect that? Or I was never going to get this. And actually, there's no room in the middle for compromise. There's no room in the middle for that grey area. And your automatic way that you speak to yourself is, oh, if one thing went wrong, well, then I'm going to sack it all off and I'm going to take my hands off, because what's the point? I'm not going to do a good enough job anyway. Another type of self-talk that I most definitely see show up with my clients is diminishing the positives. You'll hear me talk about this on my stories so incredibly much, is celebrating your wins. And something that I encourage my clients to do is, we do this on a regular basis. Sometimes we do it at the beginning of a session. Sometimes we do it at the end of a week. Sometimes we just do it randomly. When they start giving me their wins randomly, I know that we're making progress. And the reason being is, when your negative self-talk shows up in a way where you diminish the good and you diminish the positives, you constantly keep yourself stuck in this cycle of feeling inferior, of not feeling good enough. And that's where your gremlin's creeping in. Your gremlin is running wild saying, hey, you're not good enough. I told you you're not. So don't bother celebrating the good, because you're no good at it anyway. What did you expect? And this is the trap that is going to keep you from actually going for the opportunities that you want, or making the decisions you want, or going for a risk and getting rejected. So if you find yourself doing this, if you find yourself doing well in anything, in an exam, at work, in a job interview, and then you say, oh, well, it's just luck, that's you diminishing the positives. And remember, if your negative self-talk is habitual, which I'm going to take a guess that it is, then it's your job to catch these moments, all right? We want to catch them because we're going to do something differently about them. Okay, so as I have already mentioned, our job is to retrain our brain, is to let go of the narratives that no longer serve us, to change the stories up, because we are telling ourselves so many unhelpful truths, and unless we challenge them, we are going to continue believing them. It's going to impact the decisions we make in life, and it's going to impact the relationships that we have with the people around us. So that is our job from today's episode. So I'm going to take you through 4 steps to really help you gain control of your negative self-talk. This is not about, guys, banishing your negative thoughts, okay? Remember I said we've got 60 to 90,000 a day, and about 90% of those are on repeat and 85% of those are negative, okay? So the goal is to catch it, do something about it. So let's go through each of those steps now. Now, step 1, I've already kind of shared, but step 1 is you being aware of the way that you are speaking to yourself. You cannot, guys, do anything about it if you don't know what that inner voice is saying. So I want you to actually keep a diary, keep a log, keep a track of the things that you are saying to yourself. And yes, this is going to feel very awkward in the beginning. Yes, this is going to feel incredibly difficult. But what is it costing you if you don't do this? How willing are you to keep feeling less than other people? How willing are you to keep holding yourself back in life? How willing are you to not go on that date because you're worried about being rejected? So your first step is being able to identify that in a dialogue, catch those thoughts and write them down. Now, as part of this step, the other things I want you to think about are, when do you notice your negative internal dialogue showing up the most? Like, who is it the loudest with and when is it the loudest? So it might be, for example, when you're lacking sleep, when you've had a difficult day, when perhaps you've suppressed your emotions and you haven't actually acknowledged them. So really, really incredibly important. Notice when is it the loudest, but also who is it the loudest around? Because sometimes as well, when we come back to our gremlins and our adopted beliefs, we take on stories about ourselves that other people deem to be true about ourselves. And actually, we need to learn how to draw that boundary and put that down. So that's step one. It may take you a long time to really work through step one. Rather than looking at it as like, okay, tick, done, I can move on to the next one. Look at step one as something that's ongoing. Okay, step number two is, once you have those negative statements you say to yourself, is I want us to reframe it. Now, I don't care if you've tried this before. I want you to retry it. And there's a reason why. This actually came up in a recent conversation as well. Often when we are reframing, because I'm going to guarantee that some of you have already tried this and been like, Amira, this actually genuinely doesn't work. It's a hard habit to create, and that's why sometimes there can feel resistance. But often where we go wrong when it comes to reframing our negative thoughts is we go for a reframe that we just truly don't believe to be true. Now, if you can tell yourself a negative story enough times that you actually believe that you aren't good at something, or you actually believe you're a terrible speaker, or you actually believe that nobody's going to love you, or you actually believe that you're never going to find somebody, then guess what? You can do it in the reverse. So the important thing, if we're going to retrain that, is the reframe, the positive statement that you're going to swap it out for, needs to feel like not too much of a stretch. Now, I'm going to use a very basic example here, and then I think I'll use probably a little bit more of a specific one. If, for example, you are going through a really difficult financial time and your belief about yourself is, I'm rubbish with money, therefore I'm never going to have any money. You reframing that to I am rich probably isn't going to do anything. And it's because it feels so incredibly far apart. So what I want you to think about in terms of reframing is, how can you reframe it in a way that feels a little bit more positive, that feels like perhaps the next step, that doesn't feel like too much of a stretch. So I always say that we've got those negative automatic thoughts and we're trying to replace them at this stage with our positive automatic thoughts. And there's a few different ways you can do this once you've set into the reframe. Now, I am a big fan of creating visual cues, whether they are sticky notes around the house, whether you have to like write it on your bathroom mirror, whether you create a screensaver on your phone. Remember, repetition is key. When you're building a certain muscle at the gym, I don't know why I said it like that, but if you want to go and get bigger legs, if you want to go and get more toned arms, you do the same exercise for a set amount of time until you become really good at it. So I want you to think about that as you go into taking or swapping, let's say, those negative thoughts for positive ones, because we're trying to rewire your brain so that those positive thoughts become your automatic ones. And again, depending on situations as you grow and as you evolve and as you level up, it isn't saying that your negative self-talk is never going to show up. That critical voice is never going to say, hey, what were you doing? You're not really good enough. I don't know why you went for that job interview anyway. But as soon as you catch it, you're going to learn how to swap it out for the alternative that's way more positive before you end up in this spiral that you then don't know how to come out of. Now, step number 3 might feel awkward as hell, but it is backed by science and incredibly powerful. We want to create some distance between your negative self-talk and you. Your negative self-talk, that inner dialogue, that critical voice is not who you are. You think it is, but it isn't. So a great way to do that is to talk to yourself in one of two ways. One, you can talk to yourself in the third person, or two, you can actually name your internal dialogue. So I have clients who have named their negative self-talk. Now for me, I will talk to mine in my third person. So this creates distance and starts helping you to separate your identity from some of those gremlins and from some of those unhelpful beliefs. So whilst it will feel super weird in the beginning, this is something I want you to think about. Now, it doesn't matter if you're going to choose speaking to yourself in the third person, or if you're going to choose naming your negative self-talk. I want you to choose whichever option feels a little bit more comfortable. Now, step 4, one of my absolute favorites. If you find yourself in this negative spiral, the stories are running wild and you just don't know how to pull yourself out of it, I want you to use a technique called zooming out. And this is where essentially you zoom out of the granular detail that you are focused on and you think about the bigger picture. So this really means looking at it from a different perspective, taking yourself out of the moment that you're in and asking yourself, how are you going to feel in a week? How are you going to feel in a month? How are you going to feel in 6 months? Now, often it can really help give us perspective when we're stuck in a comparison cycle, when we are feeling not good enough, when our self-doubt is showing up, when we feel like we're so incredibly petrified of getting rejected. Now, the other side of this that I'm also going to leave you with that could be helpful is if you are struggling to zoom out and do that on your own, get somebody else to do it with you. And this could be a friend, this could be a family member. But I want you to have the people that you can lean on and support you when you find yourself perhaps in that cycle, or where you find your negative self-talk is being extra loud. And it might be because you've been around somebody that isn't actually that helpful or healthy for you. Or it might be because you're tired, you're feeling stressed, you're running on low energy. So there's lots of factors that can feed into this and that can heighten this. And sometimes as well, if you're in a new job, and even if it is your dream job, I've had clients say to me, Amira, I've manifested my dream job. I'm like, great, amazing. Why do you want to work with me? And like, because now I'm in it, I feel like I can't do it. And the self-doubt is actually crippling. So whilst it can feel incredibly difficult to do it on your own, don't feel like you have to. If there's people around you that you can lean on and support you, then use them. So as we come to the end of this episode, I want you to walk away being a little bit more mindful, a little bit more aware of actually your internal dialogue. And then it is on you to think about how you want to reframe it. Think about how you want to retrain your brain. Let's let go of the notion that you have to stop your negative thoughts. It's very unlikely that's going to happen, if not impossible. So let's work with what we've got. Let's actually think about learning the tools to help you manage it, because the more you can do that, the more you're going to catch yourself in those moments before it actually stops you showing up for the things that you really, truly want to achieve in your life. So be patient with yourself, be kind, and I look forward to hearing how you're getting on. Guys, thanks for joining us for another conversation this week. You know the deal by now, so please hit subscribe, leave a review. Don't forget to share this with a friend. And if you want to come and hang out with me, then click Instagram. You'll find me at _communication expert.